So let's talk about something that's at the very heart of Australia's migration system. It's a huge question, really. When the government makes a promise that thousands of people literally build their lives on, can it just change the rules halfway through? We're going to break it all down. I mean, just put yourself in their shoes for a second. Imagine making those massive, life-altering decisions. You move your entire family, you buy a home, you get your kids settled in a new school, all of it based on a clear pathway to a new life. And then what happens if that pathway suddenly has a giant roadblock that was never, ever mentioned before? Okay, so to really get what's at stake here, you first have to understand the promise itself. Australia set up a specific visa program for a very good reason, to get skilled people into its regional areas, which, are often desperate for workers. And it's designed to be a really clear two-stage journey. And this lays it out perfectly. First, you get a provisional visa. Then comes the really crucial part. You have to commit. You live and work in a regional area for at least 3 years. You become part of the local community. You contribute to the economy. And then, after you've held up your end of the bargain, you can apply for that final permanent visa. It's a pretty straightforward deal, right? Now, let's zoom in on the fine print, because this is where the promise was really spelled out. If you look at the permanent Subclass 191 visa, you'll see a critical little detail. No minimum income. The deal was simple. Just prove you've been working by showing your tax returns and you're good. And this wasn't some mistake. It was a deliberate choice to attract people for essential jobs in the regions that are often lower paying.
So this is where the trouble starts brewing. What if, after people have already packed up their lives, moved, and are partway through that 3-year commitment, the government just decides to change the rules? What if they suddenly bring in a minimum income requirement that they specifically said wasn't there before? Right now, this is the rule. $0. A big fat zero. Just prove you're working and paying your taxes. This is the bedrock, the foundation that literally thousands of families have built their new lives on in regional Australia. And then, bam, this could be the new reality. A sudden jump to over $73,000 a year. Now, if you're working in aged care or on a farm in a regional town, that is a huge, and for many, an absolutely impossible leap. This quote just nails it, doesn't it? It is the textbook definition of unfair. You do everything right, you follow every single rule, you fulfill your end of the deal, only to find out at the very last second that the finish line has been yanked out of reach. And the fallout from this, it's not just some abstract idea. It's a real-life chain reaction. We're talking about families who've put down roots, suddenly facing the prospect of being uprooted all over again. And the regional towns that rely on them, they lose crucial workers in aged care, in farming, and so many other areas. A broken promise to one person becomes a broken piece of the entire community. Well, as you can imagine, a move like this would not go unchallenged. No way. The Australian legal system has checks and balances for a reason, and you can bet this scenario would end up straight in the courts. So let's look at how that fight would actually play out. The key legal idea here is retrospectivity. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's not about changing the past. It's about changing the future consequences of things you've already done. So, you got a visa under one set of rules, you acted based on those rules, and now, suddenly, those rules have changed, creating a totally new negative outcome for you. So, how would you fight this in court? Well, there are basically 3 main weapons in your legal arsenal. First, procedural fairness. You'd argue the whole process was unjust. Second, accrued rights. You'd claim you had a legally protected right to the original deal. And third, you could even go big and make a constitutional challenge, arguing that this change is basically a punishment that only a court has the power to hand down. And this, right here, is the central legal battlefield. The whole thing would probably boil down to this question. Did these migrants have a legally protected accrued right to that permanent visa pathway, or was it just a mere expectation? A hope that the government wouldn't pull the rug out from under them. The answer could decide the fate of thousands. Now, to figure out how this may all unfold, we've got to look at history. Because believe it or not, this wouldn't be the first time an Australian government has made massive retrospective changes to the migration system. So if your visa was refused because of a new rule, what do you do? Well, there are different places you can appeal. Some tribunals can look at the specific facts of your case, but the bigger fight, the one that challenges whether the rule change itself was even legal to begin with, that would have to go to the higher federal courts. Yeah, back in the late 2000s, the government used what was called a cap and cease policy. They just canceled thousands of existing visa applications, wiped them off the books. And while it survived the initial legal challenges, the move was widely called out for what it was, a profound injustice. It set a really worrying precedent for the kind of situation we're talking about now.
You know, all of this feeds into a much bigger, ongoing tug-of-war in Australian democracy. It's the power of the government to make whatever laws it wants versus the power of the courts to make sure those laws are actually fair and constitutional. And the government has a very powerful trump card in this struggle. It's called the legislative override. Basically, if a court says, hey, what you did was illegal, Parliament can just pass a new law that says, actually, scratch that. What we did was legal all along. It's like a retroactive get-out-of-jail-free card. But this tactic is, as you can imagine, super controversial. I mean, Australia's Human Rights Commissioner has warned that this kind of behavior fundamentally undermines the rule of law. It sends a message that the government sees the courts not as a vital check on its power, but just as an annoying obstacle to get around. So, is there a fair way to handle these kinds of changes? Yes, absolutely. It's a standard practice, and it's called grandfathering. It's simple. When you bring in a new, tougher rule, you make sure it doesn't apply to the people who are already in the system under the old rules. This isn't some radical new idea. It's been common practice for decades. And the legal world is pretty much united on this. Making a major change like this without protecting the people already in the pipeline is seen as just fundamentally unfair. It's considered unjust and, frankly, just plain bad lawmaking because it shatters the trust between the government and the people who've been playing by its rules. Which brings us right back to that final, critical question. This isn't really just about one specific visa rule. It's about whether a clear path laid out in black and white law is a real, reliable promise or just a temporary guideline that can be erased at any moment. Ultimately, it forces us all to ask, what is a promise from the government really worth?